Is this a comedy routine? The aide snickered at Caleb's grease-stained flannel. Rear Admiral Sterling didn't look up. Let him speak. He wants level 5 radiation clearance. So, Mr. O'Malley, in these imaginary missions, what was your kill count? 5. The room erupted in mocking laughter. Caleb didn't smile. He placed a jagged piece of black shrapnel on the mahogany. You want the number for the files, or the one that screams when I close my eyes? His rusted voice silenced the room instantly. 112, he whispered, locking eyes with her. They didn't call me a soldier. They called me the Viper. Where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments. If this journey of valor touched you, consider subscribing to Silent Veterans and help us give a voice to more incredible stories of our silent veterans. The air conditioning in the waiting room at Naval Station Norfolk was set to a temperature that Caleb O'Malley could only describe as morgue chill. It was a sterile, lifeless cold that seeped through the worn leather of his burgundy jacket, settling deep into the shrapnel scars that mapped his left shoulder like a jagged constellation. Caleb shifted in the ergonomic chair, the plastic groaning under his weight. At 74 hours, he was a mountain of a man slowly eroding under the elements of time. His hands, resting on his knees, were rough, calloused from decades of welding and carpentry, knuckles swollen with arthritis, fingernails permanently darkened by grease. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who fixed transmissions for cash under the table. Mr. O'Malley. The voice belonged to a young lieutenant, a kid with a haircut so sharp it looked painful and a uniform that had never seen a speck of mud. The boy stood in the doorway, holding a clipboard with 2 fingers as if the paper itself were contaminated. That's me, Caleb rumbled. His voice was a low gravel, the result of years inhaling things human lungs were never meant to filter. Admiral Sterling will see you now. Keep it brief. She has a budget meeting with the Pentagon in 20 minutes, and she's already running behind. Caleb stood up slowly, his right knee clicking audibly. The lieutenant winced, not out of sympathy, but out of distaste. To this sleek, modern Navy, Caleb was just debris, a piece of driftwood that had washed up on their pristine shore, demanding attention they felt he didn't deserve. He followed the aide down a corridor that smelled of lemon polish and ozone. They passed portraits of past commanders, men with stern faces and heavy racks of medals. Caleb knew a few of them. He knew the things they had done in the dark, so that these clean hallways could stay bright. In here, the lieutenant said, pushing open a set of heavy double doors. The conference room was massive. One wall was dominated by a high-definition screen displaying a global map, glowing with blue logistic routes. In the center, around a table made of polished mahogany that probably cost more than Caleb's house, sat the tribunal. Rear Admiral Julianne Sterling sat at the head. She was younger than Caleb expected, perhaps early 50s, with eyes like polished steel and a posture that suggested she had never made a mistake in her life. Flanking her were 2 commanders and a captain, all typing furiously on slim laptops. Sterling didn't look up as Caleb entered. She flipped a page in a physical file folder, a thin, pathetic-looking thing. Sit, she commanded, still reading. Caleb pulled out a chair. It scraped against the floor, a harsh screech that made the captain to his right cringe. Caleb sat, folding his hands on the table. He didn't salute. He was a civilian now, and frankly, he wasn't sure this woman deserved one. Mr. O'Malley, Sterling finally said, closing the folder and clasping her hands. She looked at him with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a bug. You've filed a relentless series of appeals with the VA regarding a sophisticated lung condition. You claim it's from exposure to level 5 chemical agents during a classified operation in 1982. It's not a claim, Admiral, Caleb said softly. It's a fact. I cough up blood 3 mornings a week. My doctor says my alveoli look like they were scrubbed with steel wool. Sterling sighed, a short, sharp exhalation of impatience. Mr. O'Malley, I have looked at your service record. It is sparse. You were a mechanic, motor pool. According to this, you spent the early 80s fixing Jeeps in West Germany. That was the cover, Caleb said. A ripple of amusement went through the room. The young lieutenant by the door snorted, trying to cover it with a cough. The cover, Sterling repeated, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. Of course, it's always a cover. Every old man who walks into this base with a sad story and an empty bank account was secretly Rambo, isn't that right? I don't want money, Caleb said, his voice steady, though his pulse was beginning to hammer against his ribs. I want the medical clearance. The treatment is experimental. The VA won't pay for it unless the Navy admits I was there. Unless you admit Operation Nightfall happened. The name hung in the air for a second. Sterling didn't flinch. She just leaned back, her chair creaking expensively. There is no record of an Operation Nightfall in the archives, Mr. O'Malley, and frankly, this performance is insulting to the men and women who actually have documented valor. She gestured to his jacket. You come in here, dressed like a drifter, smelling like diesel and old tobacco, and you expect me to sign a document that commits federal resources based on a fairy tale? It wasn't a fairy tale when the mortars started landing, Caleb whispered. Sterling laughed. It was a cold, dry sound. Oh, save the drama. You want respect, you want honor, earn it. You don't get to steal valor just because you're old and sick. She stood up, signaling the meeting was over. Lieutenant, show Mr. O'Malley the exit and flag his file. If he appeals again, I want him charged with fraud. Caleb didn't move. He remained seated, staring at the grain of the wood table. The room went silent. The disrespect was a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders. He felt the heat rising in his neck, not shame, but a burning, righteous anger. You think this is a joke? Caleb said. It wasn't a question. Sterling stopped halfway to the door. She turned back, her eyes narrowing. Excuse me? You think my life is a joke? You think the things we did to keep you safe were a game? Sterling walked back to the table, leaning down so her face was level with his. She smiled, cruel and sharp. Okay, hero. Let's play. If you were really some Black Ops ghost, surely you saw combat. So, tell me, just to humor me before I have you thrown out, what was your kill count? 5? 10? Did you single-handedly save the world with a wrench? The aides chuckled. The captain shook his head, typing something that was likely a joke to a colleague. Caleb looked at her. Really looked at her. He saw the softness of her hands, the unblemished skin, the arrogance of safety. Slowly, deliberately, Caleb reached into the inner pocket of his leather jacket. Security, the lieutenant shouted, his hand dropping to his sidearm. Easy, son, Caleb said calmly. He pulled his hand out. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a small, heavy object wrapped in a pristine, white silk handkerchief. He placed it on the table and unfolded the silk. It was a jagged piece of black metal, about the size of a finger. It was twisted, scorched, and ugly. A piece of shrapnel from a Soviet 152mm howitzer shell. You want a number for your paperwork, Admiral? Caleb's voice dropped an octave, resonating with a terrifying stillness. You want a metric for your budget meeting? He placed his index finger on the jagged metal. 112, Caleb said. The room went dead silent. The chuckle died in the captain's throat. 112 confirmed, Caleb continued, his eyes locking onto Sterling's, pinning her in place. That's not including the ones in the vehicles. That's just the men I had to look in the eye before I pulled the trigger, and they didn't call me a mechanic. They called me Viper. Sterling opened her mouth to speak, to dismiss him again, but Caleb closed his eyes. His fingertip pressed down hard on the sharp edge of the shrapnel. The pain was sharp, instant, and familiar, the totem transition. The moment the metal pierced his skin, the sterile smell of the conference room vanished. The hum of the air conditioner was swallowed by a roaring wind. The mahogany table dissolved into freezing mud. The white walls turned into the gray, storm-choked sky of the South Atlantic. The silence was shattered by the scream of a jet engine and the thumping, rhythmic heartbeat of heavy artillery. He wasn't in Norfolk anymore. He was back. The Falklands. The exclusion zone. And he was terrified. The cold wasn't something you felt. It was something that hated you. It wasn't the crisp, biting frost of a winter morning in Virginia. This was the South Atlantic in June, winter in the Southern Hemisphere. It was a wet, malicious, living entity that gnawed through Gore-Tex and wool, seeking the marrow of your bones. The wind didn't blow. It screamed, tearing across the treeless crags of East Falkland like a banshee mourning the dead. Caleb O'Malley lay prone in the peat moss, his body pressed so flat into the earth that he felt like he was trying to become part of the geology. He was 32 years old then, in the prime of his life, a master chief with a specialized skill set that officially didn't exist on any Navy roster. Beside him, huddled under a similar camouflage net, was Miller. Just Miller. No first name, no rank that mattered out here. Just the man who watched Caleb's back and the man whose breathing sounded like a jagged rattle in the earpiece. "Check your 6," Miller whispered. His voice was barely audible over the gale, transmitted through the bone conduction mic. "Patrol, 200 meters, moving east-southeast." Caleb shifted his scope, the movement microscopic. The world through the optic was a grainy wash of green phosphor and gray sleet. He saw them, 6 figures, hunched against the wind, rifles slung low. Argentinian conscripts, mostly kids, drafted from warm provinces and dropped onto this freezing rock with inadequate boots and terrified hearts. But among them, Caleb spotted the distinct silhouette of an officer, and something else, a darker, bulkier shape trailing behind. Spetsnaz advisors. The rumors were true. "I see 'em," Caleb breathed. "Let them pass. We aren't here for the foot soldiers. They're getting close to the wire, Viper." Hold. The nickname Viper hadn't come from a cool demeanor or a quick strike. It came from an incident in Panama where Caleb had laid in a drainage ditch for 3 days, motionless, while a venomous snake curled up on his boot for warmth. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't panicked. He had simply waited until the target walked by, took the shot, and then flicked the snake away. That patience was his weapon, but patience was running thin on Mount Kent. They had been inserted 4 days ago via a halo jump that had nearly killed them both, the crosswinds scattering their gear across a mile of rocky scrub. Their mission: locate and designate a mobile comms relay that was directing long-range Exocet missiles against the British fleet. The Brits were doing the heavy lifting, but the Americans were there in the shadows, ensuring the special hardware didn't sink a carrier. "Temperature is dropping," Miller noted. "My fingers are numb." "Wiggle 'em. Don't lose dexterity. We go at 0200. The patrol passed. The darkness deepened. At 200 hours, the wind died down just enough for the fog to roll in, a thick, soupy mist that smelled of salt and decay. It was their cover. "Move," Caleb signaled. They rose like specters from the bog. Every step was a calculation. The ground here was treacherous, a mix of sharp volcanic rock and sucking mud that threatened to pull your boots off with a wet schlup. Silence was impossible, so timing was everything. You moved when the wind howled. You froze when it lulled. They reached the perimeter of the farm complex that Intel said was abandoned. It wasn't. Through the mist, the low hum of a diesel generator throbbed. Caleb scanned the windows of the main farmhouse. Blackout curtains, but light leaked through the cracks. Thermal is picking up heat signatures. Lots of them. Miller whispered, checking his handheld device. "Viper, this isn't a relay station. It's a barracks." Intel was wrong, Caleb hissed. "Standard operating procedure. We should abort. We mark the grid and call in a Harrier strike." "No. If we call in an airstrike on a suspected position, they'll move the mobile launcher before the jets even scramble. We need to confirm the hardware is here. We need eyes on the truck." Caleb crept forward, his MP5 SD raised. The silencer looked like a thick black tube against the gray sky. He reached the wall of the barn, the wood rotting and slick with rain. He peered through a gap in the planks. His stomach dropped. It wasn't just a launcher. Inside the barn, bathed in the harsh yellow light of work lamps, was a massive, hulking vehicle, a modified launcher system, yes, but surrounded by technicians speaking Russian, not Spanish. And on the side of the missile casing, painted in stark white stencil, was a biohazard symbol. "Miller," Caleb whispered, his voice trembling for the first time in a decade. It's not conventional. They're moving chemical warheads. Mustard gas. Maybe VX. Jesus, Miller breathed. If they fire that at the fleet, thousands dead, the war escalates. World War III starts on a rock in the Atlantic. We have to blow it. We don't have enough C4 to scratch that casing without risking a dispersal. Then we disable the vehicle, the axles, the guidance system. Caleb nodded. Cover me. I'm going inside. He slipped through a side door, moving into the shadows of the barn. The smell hit him instantly. Diesel, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of grease. He moved behind a stack of crates, watching the technicians. There were 4 of them. 2 guards by the main doors. He needed to place a magnetic charge on the guidance console inside the cab of the truck. It was 30 feet of open ground. He waited for a technician to drop a wrench. The clang echoed. Caleb moved. He was a ghost, a shadow detaching itself from the wall. He reached the truck, sliding under the chassis. He worked quickly, his frozen fingers fumbling with the timer on the charge. 10 minutes. Set. He rolled out. He was halfway back to the crates when it happened. A door opened. A guard walked in, lighting a cigarette. The flare of the match illuminated the barn. The guard looked down. He saw the wet boot prints on the dry concrete. He looked up. He saw Caleb. For a second, nobody moved. The guard's eyes went wide, the cigarette falling from his lips. Caleb raised his weapon. Foot. 2 rounds. The guard dropped, but the body hit a tool bench on the way down, a crash of metal. Alarm! Screamed one of the technicians. The barn erupted. Viper, go, go! Miller screamed in his ear. Caleb sprinted for the door, firing blindly behind him to suppress the guards. He burst out into the cold night air just as the siren began to wail, a mournful, mechanical shriek that tore through the fog. They're coming out of the farmhouse, Miller yelled, opening fire from his position on the ridge. His rifle chattered, dropping the first 2 soldiers who ran out the door. We need to move. The charge blows in 8 minutes. Caleb roared, sprinting up the muddy slope toward Miller. But the complex was waking up. It wasn't a squad. It wasn't a platoon. It was an entire company. Spotlights flared to life, sweeping the hillside. Bullets began to snap and hiss around Caleb, kicking up sprays of mud and rock. He dove into the shallow depression beside Miller. We're pinned, Miller shouted, changing magazines. They're flanking left and right. Caleb looked at the tactical map. The extraction point was 3 clicks south, over a ridgeline. To get there, they had to cross a flat, exposed plateau. Pop smoke, Caleb ordered. In this wind, it won't hold. Do it. Miller pulled the pins on 2 smoke grenades and hurled them. Gray smoke billowed, instantly whipped into thin ribbons by the gale, but it was enough to confuse the thermal sights for a moment. They ran, lungs burning, legs screaming. They scrambled up the scree. The sound of pursuit was a roar behind them. Shouts, engines starting. The heavy thump, thump, thump of a mounted machine gun opening up. They crested the ridge. Safety was in sight. Then Miller jerked, a violent, unnatural spasm. He spun around and collapsed face first into the mud. Miller! Caleb skidded to a stop, sliding back down to grab him. He rolled his friend over. The round had taken Miller in the thigh, severing the femoral artery. The blood was black in the moonlight, pumping out with terrifying speed. Go, Miller gasped, his face instantly pale. Leave me. Shut up, Caleb growled, ripping a tourniquet from his vest. I'm not leaving you. Viper, look. Miller pointed back down the hill. The fog had lifted. Below them, a line of headlights stretched from the farmhouse, trucks, APCs, and hundreds of infantrymen swarming up the hill like ants. You can't carry me and outrun them, Miller whispered, his hand gripping Caleb's wrist with surprising strength. The charge. Did it blow? Boom. A dull concussion shook the ground. A fireball erupted from the barn below, blowing the roof off. Mission accomplished, Caleb said, tightening the tourniquet until Miller groaned. They're going to hunt you, Miller said. They're going to kill you, unless you stop them here. I can't stop an army, Miller. You're the Viper. Miller smiled, blood staining his teeth. You have the high ground. You have the choke point. He reached into his vest and pulled out his remaining magazines, shoving them into Caleb's chest rig. Make them pay. Buy time for the extraction chopper. Go. Caleb looked at the extraction coordinates. The chopper would be there in 20 minutes. He looked at Miller, bleeding out in the mud. He looked at the horde advancing up the hill. If he tried to drag Miller, they would both die in 5 minutes. If he stayed and fought, he could hold the ridge. He could channel them into the narrow pass. I'll come back for you, Caleb promised. Just make it count, Miller wheezed. Caleb scrambled 50 yards up to a rock outcropping that overlooked the only path up the ridge. He settled the MP5. It wasn't enough range. He slung it and unlimbered the SR-25 marksman rifle from his back. He took a breath. He forced his heart rate down. He became the stone. The first wave of soldiers reached the bottleneck. Crack. A soldier fell. Crack. Crack. 2 more. The advance halted. They shouted orders in Spanish and Russian. They didn't know how many men were up there. They thought it was a squad. They pushed again. Caleb didn't fire rapidly. He fired rhythmically. Every shot was a decision. Every pull of the trigger was a life ended. He aimed for officers. He aimed for radio operators. He aimed for the heavy weapon teams. Reload. His shoulder ached from the recoil. The barrel was hot enough to sear skin. They started using mortars. Explosions walked up the hillside, shaking the earth, raining dirt and shrapnel down on him. A piece of rock sliced his cheek. He didn't wipe the blood. Crack. 100 meters. Crack. 80 meters. They were getting closer. He could see their faces now. The fear. The anger. They were just men. They had mothers. They had fear. But they were between him and home. They were the reason Miller was dying in the mud. He ran out of sniper ammo. He switched to the MP5. Come on! He screamed into the roaring wind, a primal challenge to the universe. Come on! They rushed him. A human wave. Caleb stood up. He didn't hide anymore. He fired in controlled bursts. The submachine gun chattered, spitting hot brass into the snow. Men dropped. They faltered. The sheer violence of his resistance broke their nerve. They pulled back to regroup. He checked his watch. 20 minutes. The chopper was inbound. He looked down at his magazine. Empty. He drew his sidearm. 2 mags left. He looked down the hill. Bodies were scattered like ragdolls across the gray rocks. He tried to count them, to make sense of the carnage, but the numbers blurred. He scrambled back to Miller. Hey, Caleb whispered, shaking him. Hey, buddy. Chopper's coming. Miller didn't answer. His eyes were open, staring up at the Southern Cross. The snow was settling on his eyelashes. He was gone. Caleb fell to his knees. The adrenaline crashed. The cold rushed back in. A tidal wave of misery. He grabbed Miller's vest and shook him, screaming into the dead man's face, begging him to wake up. But the only answer was the sound of the enemy regrouping below. The thwup, thwup, thwup of rotors cut through the wind. A dark shape loomed over the ridge. A rope dropped. Climb! The crew chief screamed over the PA. Caleb looked at the rope. Then he looked at Miller. He grabbed Miller's harness and clipped it to the hook. Take him, Caleb signaled. We can't take both. Weight limit with this wind. Get on. Caleb unclipped himself. He clipped Miller. He waved the chopper up. No, no, the crew chief yelled. Caleb pointed his gun at the pilot. Go, he mouthed. The chopper rose, taking the body of his friend into the safety of the sky. Caleb stood alone on the ridge. He turned back to the enemy. He had a pistol and a knife. He waited. They came cautiously this time. They thought he was gone. When they saw the lone figure standing in the moonlight, jacket torn, face masked in blood and mud, they hesitated. Caleb raised the pistol. 1. He whispered. Bang. 2. Bang. He didn't fight for survival anymore. He fought for the silence. He fought until the slide locked back. He fought until he was using the empty gun as a hammer. He fought until the darkness took him, not in death, but in a swarm of rifle butts and boots. They didn't kill him. They were too afraid of him to kill him. They wanted to know what kind of demon fought like that. As he lost consciousness, lying in a pile of the men he had killed, he did the math. The ridge was covered. The pass was choked with them. 112. He remembered every face. The flashback ends abruptly. The smell of cordite and copper blood faded. The freezing wind died. The silence of the conference room returned, heavy and suffocating. Caleb opened his eyes. He was still pressing the shrapnel into the table. A single drop of blood from his finger had pooled on the wood, next to the jagged metal. He looked up. He wasn't crying. His eyes were dry, ancient, and terrifyingly empty. Rear Admiral Sterling was staring at him. Her mouth was slightly open. The color had drained from her face. She looked at the scar on his neck, then at the shrapnel, then at his eyes. She saw it. She saw the graveyard he carried inside him. That, Caleb whispered, his voice cracking, is the cost of your budget cut. The silence that followed Caleb's story wasn't the silence of respect. It was the stunned, fragile silence of people who had just watched a man tear his own soul open and were too terrified to look at the wreckage. Rear Admiral Sterling blinked, the spell breaking. She shook her head slightly, as if trying to dislodge the image of the frozen ridge Caleb had just described. Her eyes hardened. She was a creature of regulation, of order, and Caleb O'Malley was chaos. He was a disruption to her schedule, a stain on her mahogany table, and now, a liability. That is a very vivid imagination, Mr. O'Malley, Sterling said, her voice trembling slightly before she clamped down on it with iron control. She pushed her chair back, the screech of the wheels sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. But we are not here to listen to ghost stories. We deal in documentation. In facts, she pointed a manicured finger at the drop of blood on the table. You are unstable, you come into a high-security facility, you damage government property, and you exhibit signs of severe PTSD and delusion. I am terminating this meeting immediately. She reached for the secure phone on the console beside her. Lieutenant, call the MPs. Have Mr. O'Malley escorted to the gate. If he resists, authorize them to detain him for a psychiatric evaluation. The young lieutenant, pale and sweating, reached for his radio. Yes, Admiral. Caleb didn't move. He didn't plead. He slowly folded the white silk handkerchief back over the jagged piece of shrapnel, hiding the ugly truth of 1982 from their clean, modern eyes. He slid it back into his pocket. You don't have to call them, Caleb said, his voice weary. I'm leaving. I don't know why I thought you'd understand. You people. You read about war in books. You think it has rules. Get out. Sterling hissed, picking up the receiver. She began to dial. 1. 9. The heavy double doors at the back of the room didn't open. They were thrown wide with a force that rattled the frames. Put the phone down, Julianne. A voice boomed. It wasn't a shout. It was a command. A baritone resonance that carried the weight of absolute, unquestionable authority. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. Standing there were 4 men in charcoal gray suits. No insignias, no badges, just earpieces and the distinct predatory posture of men who worked for agencies that didn't have websites. They fanned out instantly, securing the corners of the room. But it was the man walking between them who sucked the oxygen out of the air. He was old, perhaps in his late 70s, leaning heavily on a cane made of black walnut. He wore a simple civilian suit, but the lapel pin, a tiny gold rosette with blue stars, screamed louder than any uniform. Behind him, an aide carried a thick, leather-bound briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. Rear Admiral Sterling dropped the phone. It clattered against the console. She stood up so fast she nearly knocked her chair over. Mr. Secretary, she stammered. It was the Honorable Harlan Graves, the Secretary of the Navy. A living legend who had transitioned from a decorated combat career to the highest civilian office in the maritime service. He didn't look at Sterling. He didn't look at the map on the wall. He walked straight toward Caleb. The aides and junior officers flattened themselves against the walls, terrified to even breathe. Caleb stood up slowly, his joints popping. He looked at the secretary, his eyes narrowing. He recognized the walk. He recognized the tilt of the head. "Harlan," Caleb rasped. "It's been a long time, Viper," the secretary said, stopping 3 feet from the dirty, flannel-clad mechanic. Sterling let out a breathy, nervous laugh. "Mr. Secretary, I apologize for this intrusion. This man is a disturb—" "Silence," Graves said. He didn't turn his head. The word was a slap in the face. "If you speak again, Admiral, you will be stripped of your rank before you leave this room." Graves turned to his aide. "The file." The aide unlocked the briefcase and pulled out a thick, weathered dossier. It wasn't the thin, pathetic folder Sterling had on her desk. This one was stamped with bold red letters. Top secret. No foreign. Eyes only. The seal was dated 1982. Graves slammed the folder onto the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy thud, sliding across the polished surface until it hit Sterling's tablet, knocking the expensive device to the floor. "You asked for documentation, Admiral," Graves said, his voice icy. "You wanted proof of Operation Nightfall. You couldn't find it because I personally buried it 40 years ago. Because what men like Caleb O'Malley did to save the Atlantic Fleet was so illegal, and so necessary, that admitting it happened would have toppled 3 governments." Sterling stared at the folder, her hands shaking. She opened the cover. The first page was a photograph, a grainy black-and-white reconnaissance shot of a younger Caleb O'Malley, covered in mud, standing over a pile of bodies on a rocky ridge, holding an empty pistol. The caption read, "Asset. Viper. Status. Active. Confirmed kills. 1 of 12. Single engagement." Sterling looked up, her face draining of all color. She looked at Caleb, the drifter, the nuisance. "He held the ridge," Graves said, addressing the room but keeping his eyes on Caleb. "For 6 hours. Alone. Against a reinforced mechanized company. He ran out of ammo. He ran out of hope. But he didn't run out of fight. Because of him, we extracted the intel that prevented a chemical attack on the task force. Thousands of sailors, my own son included, came home because Caleb O'Malley decided to stay." Graves shifted his weight, wincing as he straightened his bad leg. He looked at Caleb with an expression of profound sorrow and reverence. "We thought you died in the Gulag, Caleb. After the extraction, we lost tracking. Intelligence said you were executed by the Soviets in '84. I got out," Caleb said simply. "Took a while. Walked to Turkey." "You walked to Turkey," Graves repeated, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "Of course you did." The Secretary of the Navy took a step back. He adjusted his jacket. Then, slowly, painfully, he brought his heels together. The room froze. Harlan Graves, the civilian head of the United States Navy, raised his hand. He didn't offer a handshake. He rendered a slow, crisp, perfect hand salute. It wasn't a salute for a superior officer. It was the salute a warrior gives to a god of war. "Master Chief," Graves said softly. Caleb stood there, the flannel shirt hanging loosely on his frame. His chin trembled. For 40 years, he had been a ghost. He had been a crazy old man at the end of the bar. He had been a burden. Slowly, Caleb straightened his back. The arthritis, the pain, the years, they seemed to fall away. He brought his scarred and grease-stained hand up to his brow. He returned the salute. "Mr. Secretary," Caleb whispered. The black suits snapped to attention. The terrified lieutenant by the door instinctively saluted. Even the captains and commanders, realizing the gravity of the mistake they had just witnessed, scrambled to their feet and saluted. Only Sterling remained frozen, staring at the open file, realizing she had just tried to arrest a man who was written into the history books in blood. The ride down the elevator was silent. But it wasn't the heavy silence of the conference room. It was the peaceful silence of a debt finally paid. Upstairs, the shouting had begun. Secretary Graves hadn't fired Admiral Sterling publicly. That wasn't his style. He had simply asked her to remain in the room while he reassessed her command capabilities. The moment the door closed, Caleb had heard the distinct sound of a career ending. She would be reassigned to a weather station in Alaska, or perhaps a desk in the basement of the Pentagon where she could count paper clips until she retired. She was done. But Caleb didn't care about revenge. That wasn't why he had come. He walked out of the administration building into the bright, blinding sunlight of the Virginia afternoon. The air smelled of ocean salt and jet fuel, the smell of home. "My car is waiting." "Caleb," Secretary Graves said, walking beside him. "We're going to Walter Reed. I've already made the call. The best pulmonary specialists in the country are waiting for you. No forms, no waiting lists. We're going to fix those lungs." Caleb stopped at the curb. He looked at the sleek black government limousine waiting for them. Then he looked at his own truck parked across the lot, a rusted 1998 Ford F-150 with a dented bumper and a Vietnam vet sticker peeling off the back window. "I appreciate it, Harlan," Caleb said, "but I've got my own ride." Graves chuckled, shaking his head. "You haven't changed, stubborn as a mule." "It's not stubbornness," Caleb said, patting his pocket where the shrapnel lay. "It's just, I'm used to driving myself." Graves nodded, his expression softening. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a card. It was heavy, embossed stock with a direct number. "If you need anything, anything at all, you call me. No more waiting rooms. That's a direct order, Viper." Aye, sir." Caleb smiled. He walked across the parking lot. His knee hurt. His chest felt tight, the old chemical burn flaring up as he breathed the humid air. But for the first time in 40 years, the weight on his shoulders was gone. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't a liar. He was Caleb O'Malley. He reached his truck and opened the creaking door. He climbed in, the smell of old coffee and sawdust welcoming him like an old friend. He put the key in the ignition but didn't turn it. Instead, he looked out the windshield at the massive American flag flying over the base headquarters. It snapped in the wind, a vibrant slash of red, white, and blue against the sky. He thought of the cold ridge. He thought of the mud. He thought of Miller, freezing to death so that Caleb could run. He thought of the 112 men who didn't go home to their families because war is a hungry beast that demands to be fed. Caleb reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror. He saw his own eyes. They were old eyes, tired eyes, but they were no longer haunted. "We're good, Miller," he whispered to the empty cab. "We're clear." He started the engine. The old truck roared to life, a defiant growl against the pristine silence of the base. Caleb put it in gear and drove toward the gate, leaving the admirals and the politics behind him. He was just a man in a truck again. But as he passed the guard shack, the young Marine on duty, who had heard the rumors spreading like wildfire through the base comms, stepped out of the booth. The kid didn't ask for ID. He didn't wave him through. The Marine stood tall, snapped his heels together, and rendered a sharp, crisp salute. Caleb didn't salute back. He just nodded, tapped the horn once, and drove out onto the highway, merging into the traffic of a country that would never know his name, but was free because he existed. If you were moved by Caleb, Viper, O'Malley's story of quiet courage, please like this video, share it with someone who respects our veterans, and subscribe to Silent Veterans for more stories of the unassuming heroes who walk among us. They are the silent guardians, and we must never forget them.